Hi, everyone. I wanted to talk today about a couple of things about learning genetics that can be a little bit confusing. I want to talk about the role of rules in genetics, and I also want to talk about sort of the difference between phenomena that are genetics phenomena and phenomena that are non-genetics phenomena, and how that line can get a little bit blurry sometimes. All right, so let's start out by talking about genetic rules. Um, so the take-home points here that I'd like you to get are that genetic rules are really powerful, but that they always have exceptions. The second one is that differences between organisms can either be genetic or environmental. And finally, that epigenetics provides a bridge between genetics and the environment. So let's start with genetic rules. So these are the underlying principles of molecular and transmission genetics that can explain a wide range of phenomena. And they're useful for analyzing a great many situations in genetics. And so they're similar to some rules that we're accustomed to in physics. So here are some famous ones. Over here is a joke about the origins of light. And you can see this when you look at some books about physics. You know, the theory of everything, the elegant universe. That physics is really searching for rules that have no exceptions. So physics already has extraordinarily strong rules that can explain almost everything, and they're constantly pushing towards rules that have fewer and fewer exceptions, towards trying to really have a single theory of everything. But genetics rules, though powerful, always have exceptions. So let's go through some you've heard of. You've heard of the rules of dominance and recessivity. But then there are some traits, a major one being mental illness, in which it has a strong genetic component, but it's not a simple case of dominance or recessivity, nor of a single gene. Another case is we hear that the DNA is the same across all cells in an organism, but an important exception to that is cancer, in which some cells have accumulated mutations that make them cancerous. Another exception to this is this remarkable case of lamprey, which is an animal that eliminates 20% of its DNA. So it inherits the DNA, and then in its somatic cells, that is most of its body, it eliminates 20% of the DNA that it gets. Another important rule is the diploid expression of genes. That is that you inherit two different alleles, one from your mother and from your father, and that they're both expressed the same. But in fact, there's a phenomenon called imprinting, in which each one of us expresses, for certain genes, each one of us expresses only one copy. And then we have a couple more diploid inheritance of genes, but with sex chromosomes. The Y chromosome you only ever inherit from your father, and the X chromosome you inherit from, if you're a male, you only inherit it from your mother. Mitochondria we all inherit only from our mothers, and so forth. And finally, recombination. So we will be learning about recombination, the way that genes are shuffled up. But in fact, in Drosophila, there's one of the chromosomes that does not seem to undergo recombination hardly at all. So that doesn't mean, though, that recombination is not a good rule or that it's not worth studying. It means that there are always exceptions to things. So our rules are going to aim to explain 90 or 95% of cases, but there will be exceptions. And so, should we just forget about the rules? Well, I'm sure you can imagine where I'm going here. No, we should not. We can learn a very small number of genetics rules, which can help us to understand a really huge diversity of phenomena. And in fact, even the exceptions are much easier to understand if you know the rules. And also, finally, the exceptions tend to be really cool. So we're going to proceed by learning the rules, and then after we've got the rules mastered, we'll talk a little bit about the exceptions. But don't be thrown off by that. It doesn't mean that the rule doesn't hold in most cases. It's just another interesting thing to learn about genetics. So just towards you all's confusion and frustration as students. So if things are strange and you're struggling to incorporate something, don't assume it's your fault. Think critically, try to figure out, make predictions about, well, if that's why this is an exception, then what would we expect and how can I figure that out? And talk to people and ask us questions. So finally, genetics rules are powerful, but they do have exceptions. The other thing I'd like to cover here is genetics versus non-genetics and sortogenetics. So health disparities are something that we all know are very important, with various of our communities experiencing much higher rates of a wide variety of diseases, cancer, diabetes, hypertension, and mental illness just being a few of them. And we know that these causes, that the causes for these diseases can be, the causes for these differences can be quite diverse as well. Exposure to toxins, general stress, difference in access to healthcare, education, nutrition, and so forth. And here I just wanted to give a shout out to our own Leticia Marquez Magana, who works a lot on these issues of health disparity. And in fact, the Health Equity Institute, with which Leti is somewhat associated, right here at San Francisco State, is working on a lot of these issues from a variety of perspectives, from health to education to economics. And in fact, Rory is a part of this Health Equity Institute since she joined us last year. So those are instances in which the environment is leading to differences across populations in health outcomes, but there are also cases in which our genetics are doing that. So one famous case of this is sickle-cell disease. So in people who are afflicted with sickle-cell disease undergo hemolysis, which is destruction of their red blood cells. They experience anemia and a wide variety of complications. So if we look at who has sickle cell disease, we see an unfortunately similar case where minority populations, in particular African Americans in this country, have much higher rates, whereas white Americans hardly have any of these at all. But it turns out that the explanation for this is not the typical culprits of racism and stress and toxins, but instead is right in our genetics. And so on the right here, we're looking at the occurrence of a single gene, the single mutation that causes sickle cell across Africa and Southern Asia. And on the left, we're looking at the incidence of malaria. And what you can see is that they're quite closely related. In Northern Asia, we don't see it, but on the Indian subcontinent, we see both the allele and the disease, and we have this band here. Through Africa, we similarly see a very similar pattern. And it turns out that this makes sense when we know more about this HBS allele. This allele protects against malaria and yet causes sickle cell disease. Right? So this disease, this allele is both good and bad. It has good effects, protective effects, and bad effects, causing a terrible disease. So here we have a case in which African Americans' ancestry in Africa has led to their having a higher rate of this allele, which leads to a higher rate of sickle cell disease in their communities. Another famous example would just be skin cancer, in which Europeans and their descendants have lost their protective melanin with the lightening of our skin, which has led to an increased exposure to ultraviolet radiation and a higher rate of skin cancer. So again, here we have an instance where we have a difference between populations, but it's not due to the environment, it's not due to the exposure, it's due to the different genetics of white, black, Hispanic, and Asian populations. And importantly, a single disease can be both. So we've said that some health outcomes have to do with environment, some have to do with genetics, but various cancers can have both environmental determinants, some of these we're familiar with, as well as genetic components. So we'll soon be reading something about Angelina Jolie's genes with the BRCA1 gene. So things can be complicated. And sometimes it's not even clear. So this actually is the pedigree of my family. So the squares, the orange squares are males, and the blue ovals are females. So this is my dad's generation. Here's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here's my dad. And so actually here's me. Okay, so I'm a descendant of my dad. And in our family, we have a high rate of pulmonary fibrosis. So in fact, I've already lost 2 uncles and 1 aunt from this disease. And pulmonary fibrosis causes scarring of lung tissues, leading to eventual shutdown of your lungs and death. But we don't know why it's in the family, right? Because my father and his family members share genetics, but they also share environment. So one possibility is that there is an allele or alleles in our family that are causing this disease, because pulmonary fibrosis is sometimes caused by mutations. And that's heightened by the fact that my grandparents were actually related. They were, I think, second cousins. So it's possible that they both had inherited the same recessive deleterious allele from one of their ancestors, and that has been passed down to some of my aunts and uncles. But another possibility is that this was an environmental cause. My dad and his siblings grew up on a farm. They used DDT, which is an insecticide which is now banned, or they could have been exposed to other toxins. So this is a case in which even though that there's a high rate of this disease in our family, we don't know whether it's genetics or environment, because pulmonary fibrosis is known to be caused by either one in different cases. And of course, this makes a great difference to me and my many cousins, because if it were an environmental cause, then that means that it's not something that we should also suffer from, since we grow up in different places under different circumstances than my dad and his brothers and sisters did. Whereas if it's genetics, we could still all be at risk. And so the last thing I want to mention is so that's one way it can be complicated. Sometimes we just don't know. A second way in which it can be complicated is the phenomenon of epigenetics. So phenomenon of epigenetics are when marks, a kind of chemical mark, are put on the DNA. Sorry, this should say methyl. So when methyl groups get added to cytosines, to C nucleotides. So that's represented here by these little methyl groups. So these are things where you can have either a cytosine with a methyl or without a methyl. And the presence or absence of these methyl groups affects gene transcription. So basically, the environment can cause epigenetic changes, and those epigenetic changes can lead to differences in transcription. And notably, some of these can be heritable. So we have increasing reason to think that sometimes the environment or the cell responds to the environment, the organism responds to the environment by changing these epigenetics, putting little marks on the DNA, and that these marks can be heritable. So that would mean that the environment that I experience can end up being passed down to my offspring. And hopefully we'll have time to talk about that some more later. Okay, so take-home points from this are just that genetic rules are powerful, but they always are going to have exceptions. That differences between organisms can be genetic or environmental, and that this can be complicated. Some diseases can have contributions from both, and that epigenetics provides this bridge between genetics and the environment that we're still learning more and more about every week. All right, thanks very much.